Hey everybody, and Tony here with my review of Puccini's Tosca with conductor Nicholas Milton, which I saw at the Deutsche Oper Berlin. This marks the fourth time I saw this production of Tosca because I wanted to see and hear Erwin Schrott perform the role of Baron Vitello Scarpia. Furthermore, Tatiana Serian and Joseph Calleja, who were supposed to perform the roles of Tosca and Cavaradossi respectively, canceled their performances today because Tatiana Serian had to deal with visa problems and Joseph Calleja called in sick. So even though I have my fair share of misgivings about Joseph Calleja as a singer, as well as his overall technique and the current choice of repertoire that he's been specializing in, I still wish him good health and I hope he gets well soon to perform on stage once again. Replacing them were Natalia Romanov as Tosca and Jorge De Leon as Cavaradossi, respectively, especially since Jorge De Leon managed to not only sing Alvaro yesterday, but jumped in as Cavaradossi today, thus making it such a vocal feat that he accomplished, which I will gladly talk about much later in this review. But first, Erwin Schrott as Scarpia. To say that I have a love-hate relationship with Erwin Schrott as a singer is quite an understatement. While I can never ever question, let alone doubt, his charisma as a stage actor, as well as how much of a tall and elegant presence he has on stage, and just how handsomely he manages to move around the stage as an overall stage actor, his voice leaves a lot to be desired. Look no further than my experiences with him, especially in roles such as Don Giovanni from, of course, Mozart's Don Giovanni, as well as listening to him as Ramfis from Verdi's Aida, which he recorded alongside Jonas Kaufmann and Anya Harteros as Radames and Aida, respectively. The major problem that I've always had with Erwin Schrott is the same problem I've always had with José Van Damme, Ruggero Raimondi, and Brinterfel, in which they are short baritones singing all of these bass baritone, let alone basso cantante parts, and they do so with insufficient depth and just lacking in that great basso richness, depth, and darkness that I would have loved to listen to. I would even argue that just like José Van Damme, Ruggero Raimondi, and Brinterfel, Erwin Schrott has always been more of a baritone than an actual bass baritone, which is saying something because Erwin Schrott was never a great bass baritone, let alone a great bass. He's always been a baritone, but not a particularly good one because he lacks core, he lacks depth and richness, and he lacks that overall vocal darkness that I love in many a true bass baritone, let alone a true basso cantante. And yes, he is decent in roles such as Escamillo and Scarpia, in which he has been singing this latter part for quite some time, but other than that, there have been other greater baritones who have sung Scarpia, such as Tita Ruffo, Mattia Battistini, Ettore Bastianini, Tito Gobbi, Gian Giacomo Guelfi, Gino Becchi, Cornel McNeil, Apollo Granforte, Anselmo Colzanni, Marco Rothmüller, Josef Metternich, and my personal favorite, Paul Schöffler, and even bass baritones such as Ferdinand Franz and George London, who had far richer voices and far more electric voices that could manage to navigate both the highs and the lows of this particular villain role. Even legitimate baritones such as Lawrence Tibbett, Gian Giacomo Guelfi, Leonard Warren, Gino Becchi, Tito Gobbi, Cornel McNeil, and Apollo Granforte have far more vocal size and depth than what Erwin Schrott could ever offer. And it was all thanks to their sterling techniques, especially complete with all that core in their voice, which Erwin Schrott was admittedly insufficient in. Yes, he does have a sufficiently resonant voice for someone who is actually more of a baritone than a bass baritone. And why I argue that Erwin Schrott is not a particularly great baritone is that there were occasions in which his top notes were screamy, and there were occasions in which his low notes, though resonant, were not really that resonant enough compared to a lot of the true baritones of the past. At best, he sings the role decently, but when you have a baritone who sings decently at Scarpia, it's not really that great enough. Just go consult Gian Giacomo Guelfi and Tito Gobbi for excellent renditions of Scarpia with everything they've got as vocal actors. And speaking of vocal acting, Erwin Schrott totally hams it up to compensate the fact that he is essentially a short baritone, billing himself as a bass baritone, singing a dramatic baritone role. How, you ask? Despite him having a decent start with his entrance, he resorts to screaming his commands, and he even resorts to hamming it all up by moving his hands around and even pacing around the stage and just making his Scarpia extremely unhinged all the way up to his death. And there were several occasions in which I could not take Erwin Schrott's performance as Scarpia seriously. From his shouting to his straining to even uttering G's, I just could not take Erwin Schrott seriously as a threat as Scarpia. And while I can give credit to Erwin Schrott for emitting the madman, unhinged, and total psychotic side of Scarpia to the forefront, I was not buying it in terms of how he produced his voice. Yes, it does have the potential to be sufficiently resonant as a true baritone, but his overacting hampered what little vocal nobility and strength he could offer as Scarpia. The only attributes that saved Erwin Schrott as Scarpia was his tall and commanding stage presence, his penchant for making Scarpia such an unhinged madman, those sparse moments of vocal resonance, and just how much he was able to let it rip theatrically, although, let's face it, it was quite hammy to witness, and he did compromise the sleazy gentleman side of Scarpia to make him more of an unhinged madman. And every time he tries to sing over the orchestra, he did resort to screaming, he did resort to straining his voice, and other unpleasant vocal mannerisms that made his performance of Scarpia far from being the greatest of all time. In fact, his performance as Scarpia was decent at best in terms of what he could do to make this villain unhinged, but lacking in terms of authentic vocal quality, whether it's from a true baritone, let alone a bass baritone singing Scarpia. His vocal technique left a lot to be desired, but I could still give him some credit for at least being intrepid enough to tackle this role that he has been singing for many years. Therefore, the role of Scarpia would have fit Erwin Schrott like a glove on paper, but how he executed it left a lot to be desired. The true hero of today's performance of Tosca was Jorge De Leon. Yes, he did have those vocal flaws of that wobble that otherwise makes his voice unpleasant to listen to, but I cannot deny the metal and the steel and that absolute strength that he has in his voice, especially when he lets his high notes rip and lets his voice just ring throughout the theater. And mind you, I also saw and heard Senor De Leon in that very same role barely 7 to 6 years ago at the Deutsche Oper Berlin. And back then, he was a lot stabler in terms of his vocal production. This time, the vibrato ended up becoming a lot looser and a lot more all over the place, but he does have those very sparse moments of tenderness. Nevertheless, Senor De Leon's greatest asset is using that metallic and wild voice to his advantage in terms of letting his high notes ring throughout the theater, as well as making it boom for everybody to listen to. Jorge De Leon's voice has always been exciting, always been thrilling to listen to, but it is flawed in the sense that it lacks vocal beauty, especially when it comes to true old school singers such as Galliano Massini, Mario del Monaco, and my personal favorite Cavaradossi of all time, Franco Corelli. And lest I forget about Ludovic Spies, who is also a great Cavaradossi, but Franco Corelli reigns supreme as my personal favorite in that role. There's no doubt that Jorge De Leon's laser-like voice saved the day, but that loose vibrato and that wobble that he has been developing these years, but they were otherwise small dents to pay for such an otherwise exciting vocal experience that Jorge De Leon managed to deliver every single time he was on stage. And I can never fault his manly virility, especially when being confronted by Erwin Schrott's Scarpia. Jorge De Leon was the naturally more supreme vocal actor in terms of just going big, as well as knowing that he is in that moment and doesn't really need to do all of those unnecessary movements unless he has a reason to do certain movements, such as when he laughs to show his irony at the situation that he's in, and even run around the stage before he belts out his triumphant Vittoria, Vittoria, and that high B flat of his was still as fantastic and ringing as ever. All vocal misgivings aside in terms of that loose vibrato and that wobble that unfortunately have become issues with Jorge De Leon aside, I could still give him mega loads of credit for everything that he accomplished as a singer who let everything out and who managed to take great advantage of his steely, dramatic tenor voice to the best of his abilities, and of course, for always providing an exciting listening experience. Natalia Romanov was actually a lot stronger as Tosca in this performance. When I first heard her, I thought she was good all the way through. This time, she was way better. Her chest tones were a lot more resonant. Her head voice and chest voice were a lot more well coordinated, and she did have a lot more steely top notes at her disposal. However, there were occasions in which she still sang in the mask, which otherwise made her voice sound rather nasal and kind of buzzy, which was really annoying to listen to. But other than that, the fact that she managed to take advantage of those chest tones and her head voice, as well as her top notes, especially her high Cs in which she threw like comets, as well as daggers just flying all over the air, were absolutely superb. I would even argue that Natalia Romanov's greatest assets were her top notes, which were blazing and were absolutely brilliant to listen to, almost like Leonie Rysanek when she lets loose with those top notes. And yes, I will always have Celestina Boninsegna, Bianca Scacciatti, Gina Cinia, Germana Di Giulio, Anne Rosell, Luba Village, Frances Yind, Valburga Vegna, Maria Caniglia, Maria Pedrini, Renata Tebaldi, Maria Callas, and Leonie Rysanek as my personal favorite Toscas of all time, especially when it comes to Renata Tebaldi's gorgeous chest tones, Maria Caniglia's complete package through her chest tones and her blazing high Cs, especially where her chest tones are concerned, Maria Callas being the absolute complete package in terms of combining vocal beauty and strength, as well as complete artistry as a singer, and even Leonie Rysanek blasting her top notes left and right, and lest I forget about Birgit Nilsson, Maria Iritsa, and even Lotte Lehmann, who was also that well coordinated as Tosca and who also had a sterling technique in everything she sang. Yes, Natalia Romanov still falls short as to what these old school sopranos could accomplish, but her artistry as well as her total dedication to her craft were unparalleled and can never be questioned. She's in a class of her own, and I still hope that she continues to develop her technique in the right way, eliminate mask singing, as well as use her pharynx to make the best out of her voice. Because even though she is essentially a full lyric soprano, singing all of these demanding spinto soprano / dramatic soprano roles these days, there is still a wonderful instrument that she managed to use so well, and I do not want to hear her talents being squandered anytime soon. She's got great material to work with, but she has to continue developing her voice in the right way, as well as even take inspiration from the likes of Celestina Boninsegna, Maria Iritsa, Lotte Lehmann, Bianca Scacciatti, Gina Cinia, Maria Caniglia, and Maria Pedrini, as well as the many old school sopranos who have sang Tosca and have found success in that particular role. While not up to par with those old school sopranos of the past, Natalia Romanov was in a class of her own, and she was a lot vocally stronger as Tosca. Poor Rowan was in much better vocal shape today in stark comparison to what he sang as his final Mayor in La Forza del Destino, in which there was a caprino in his voice. That caprino today was surprisingly gone. And while his voice is not up to par with Melchiorre Luises, Salvatore Baccaloni's, Italo Tayos, and Fernando Correna's as the greatest sacristans of all time, Porrick Rowan continues to show potential for growth as well as use his fine bass baritone voice to the best of his abilities. Samuel Dale Johnson is still reliable as Cesare Angelotti, but I cannot buy a Cavalier baritone singing this bass role at all. Yes, Samuel Dale Johnson has the stirring stage presence to make Cesare Angelotti's desperation and want to escape from Scarpia's clutches come to life and come to the full forefront, and even make it palpable for us, the audience, to witness. However, Samuel Dale Johnson's voice is ill-suited for a bass role like Angelotti. This is a baritone who is far more capable of singing the likes of Valentin from Faust, Mercutio from Romeo et Juliette, Frédéric from Lakmé, Zurga from Le Pêcheur de Perles, Gollon from Péléas et Mélisande, Ford from Falstaff, and even Rodrigo di Posa from Don Carlo. In fact, I would rather see and hear Samuel Dale Johnson perform the likes of Rodrigo from Don Carlo, Ford from Falstaff, Conte di Luna from Trovatore, Gunther from Götterdämmerung, the Herald from Lohengrin, Valentin from Faust, and Frédéric from Lakmé, instead of something as deep and cavernous as Cesare Angelotti, because who I have in my ears are the likes of Carlo Cava and Giancarlo Lucardi, who were superb basses who also made the best out of Angelotti. Regardless of whatever vocal caveats I had with Samuel Dale Johnson's Cavalier baritone voice being put to not so fantastic use as Cesare Angelotti, I could still give him credit for his artistry as well as his commitment as a singing actor. Jörg Schörner is still as involving and awesome to listen to and even watch as Spoletta, although there have been arguably better character tenors who specialized in that role, including Piero de Palma as well as Angelo Mercuriali and Franco Ricciardi, whose techniques were far more fully realized and far stronger. There were occasions in which Jörg Schörner's chest voice wasn't really that properly engaged, but other than that, he still gave an exciting performance as this minion role, and he was able to deliver some interesting singing using his character tenor voice to make the best out of Spoletta. Artur Garbas may not be the type of voice I would associate singing Sciarrone, but he does make the best out of this minion and also used his lyric baritone voice to make the best out of this minion, as well as use his stage presence to also make him a fully realized character, as stoic as he was. Byung-gil Kim was also an imposing jailer who also used his crudely toned but quite exciting bass baritone voice to the best of his abilities, and Lola Haberstock was absolutely sweet as the shepherd boy. So overall, although Erwin Schrott's vocal acting and singing left so much to be desired as Baron Scarpia, I could still give him credit for what he was able to do in terms of making Scarpia such a madman, but it was at the expense of omitting Scarpia's more noble side as well as his more aristocratic side, thus making his performance of Scarpia a totally loose cannon and absolutely unhinged, both vocally and theatrically. Yes, Senor Schrott's voice does pale in comparison to a lot of the legitimate baritones of the past, but I cannot question just how much he was able to be intrepid enough to not only attempt this role that he's been singing for many years, but also have a go at it in this particular production of Tosca. So at best, he was decent on his own, but at worst, he just does not hold up to a lot of the great performers of Scarpia, such as Gian Giacomo Guelfi and Tito Gobbi, who were legitimate baritones. At least there was exciting singing to be found from Jorge De Leon, as well as much better singing to be found in Natalia Romanov as Floria Tosca. Despite Erwin Schrott being decent at best as Scarpia, I would really love to have a great singer in that particular villain role. Erwin Schrott might not cut it, but at least he was able to give it a go, as well as provide his own spin on this role as an unhinged and over-the-top madman. However, when all is said and done, Jorge De Leon and Natalia Romanov stole the show from everybody's feet, with also some contributing players ranging from Porrick Rowans, finally sung Sacristan, to Samuel Dell Johnson, still doing a decent job as Angelotti, although his cavalier baritone voice is not really one I would associate as Angelotti, to Jörg Schörner being a fine vocal actor as Spoletta, as he's always been. The conducting done by Nicholas Milton was good for the most part. There were occasions it did lack that additional fire and passion, and there were occasions in which there was something that was dragging, and there were also occasions in which I felt like it was kind of lacking in excitement, but it was still decently conducted. He was still able to be a lot better, especially in the later parts of the opera. And there was that occasion in which the brass tended to override the whole orchestra in the beginning of the third act, but otherwise he was still a decent conductor who kept everybody together. And of course, what more can you expect from the chorus and orchestra of the Deutsche Oper Berlin? Everybody was in their A game, as they've always been, and they can always be relied on in terms of strengthening the overall performance. So while I may have my misgivings about Erwin Schrott as Baron Scarpia, in terms of him not actually being a great baritone, but more of a short baritone with a tendency to yell and scream his lines and even act all hammy all the way through, I could still give him credit for his intrepidness, as well as having some moments of resonance, but not enough to really save his performance of Scarpia altogether. He did fall short on those vocal demands, and he did also fall short on those theatrical demands, but he was able to give his own spin as an unhinged and absolutely loose cannon of a Scarpia, both vocally and theatrically, which was quite fun to watch. But other than that, his vocal resources left a lot to be desired. And despite the flaws I've noticed with Jorge De Leon and Natalia Romanov, I could still say that they were a lot stronger in their respective roles, with Jorge De Leon being absolutely committed, especially considering that he sang Don Alvaro yesterday, and this time he ended up jumping in for Joseph Calleja as Cavaradossi, yet he continues to be as consistent as a performer, thus letting loose with all of his high notes and his big notes ringing throughout the theater, and he did so with such aplomb despite the flaws he had in his voice, and Natalia Romanov actually growing stronger as a singer. Therefore, I definitely have to give my hat off to Senor De Leon and Madame Romanov for everything that they've accomplished as both Cavaradossi and Tosca respectively. Therefore, I totally have to give my hat off to Senor De Leon and Madame Romanov for what they've accomplished as Cavaradossi and Tosca respectively. And I still have to give some credit to Erwin Schrott for what he was able to do with Scarpia in terms of making him an unhinged madman, but other than that, you may as well stick with other better performers of that role, whether it be Gian Giacomo Guelfi as Scarpia, or even bass baritones such as George London, unless they forget about Samuel Ramey. But if you do like Erwin Schrott as Scarpia, you could give him a chance, because maybe there might be something that you like that I probably don't like in his voice, but at least he was still able to show that unhinged side with everything that he's got. And for those of you who caught this particular production of Puccini's Tosca at the Deutsche Oper Berlin, what'd you think of it? Did you enjoy Erwin Schrott's portrayal of Scarpia, flaws and all, even though you feel like his voice isn't really suitable for any role, let alone a Scarpia? Was there a moment that you really liked Erwin Schrott as Scarpia in, whether it be in the first act or in the second act? And was there something that you definitely liked about his performance? Or did you feel like he fell short out of what he could accomplish as Scarpia? Please comment below and let me know. Well, that's it for my review of Puccini's Tosca at the Deutsche Oper Berlin, starring Erwin Schrott as Scarpia. Tune in next time for my review of course, Puccini's Tosca, also at the Deutsche Oper Berlin, this time with Joseph Calleja as Cavaradossi, but from what I heard, Freddie De Tomaso might end up taking over as Cavaradossi. We'll see. So until then, good night everybody, and happy Easter Monday!